Good evening, and welcome to a continuation of Acton 250's countdown to the momentous events of April 1775. And so, it is now fall of 1774. And the full weight of the imperial response to the destruction of the tea is being felt throughout the Massachusetts Bay Colony. It will be my pleasure in a few moments to introduce Malcolm Purinton to explain how taverns fit into the New England way of life in that period. Our recent speakers have created a context for this evening's talk. Mary Fuhrer explained the social structure, it being hierarchical and patriarchal. Everyone fit in somewhere, and they knew their place. Bob Gross clarified the growing generational tension in towns like Concord and Acton. Young adults, eager to be independent within a community, wishing to preserve traditional control over town meetings and the salaries of judges. Before we go further, please notice over here a display of books and materials for our partners, including the library hosting you this evening, Ironwork Farm, which we'll discuss in a moment, the Acton Historical Society, and Freedom's Way. On the far end of the tables, there are cards, a number of cards that would help you purchase merchandise if you would wish to, which would be of help to us. Last year, we heard Professor Joseph Edelman about the essential role of newspapers in the communication of news up and down the seacoast and back and forth to England. And where would rural residents have likely learned of the news but in their local tavern? How fortunate we are to have one of the Acton taverns of that period still standing and welcoming visitors. Jones Tavern in South Acton, part of Ironwork Farm, Inc. Back in the back is Ann Forbes. Maybe she'll wave at me. There she is. She's waving at me. She is an authority on Jones Tavern, and on your way out, perhaps you will wish to ask her a question. And perhaps you will drive by a little bit more slowly and take a close look at it. It is now my pleasure to introduce Professor Malcolm Purinton, who has focused academically on the role of taverns since his own graduate days. May we hear a round of applause, please.
All right, how's everybody doing tonight? Good? My name is Professor Malcolm Purinton. I'm a professor at Northeastern University. And I've been studying the history of beer and alcohol for quite some time. I guess I could say since college, but it really kind of broadened. Recently published my first book on the history of the specific Pilsner style of beer. If you think about your Budweiser, you think about all your light golden lagers. I've been writing, publishing, teaching about the history of, beer and empire, beer and the home, beer and alcohol and the relationship between societies, communities, both ancient, modern, colonial. And today I'm going to talk to you specifically about one type of abode, the tavern, which for us, for this area, is very important. Very important. So, one for the Revolutionary Road. I offered a number of titles, and I felt like this one kind of worked pretty well. I'm going to write by the Minuteman Mile, write all of this stuff. The American Revolution can almost be a result of tavern lifestyle. We have a history going back prior to colonization. You've got to remember where a lot of these colonists were coming from. They're all coming from Western Europe, most of them from England. And English and European ways of drinking, of imbibing, and the places that they did so hadn't changed for very long. I mean, they've been going taverns, whether it's a place on the way of a pilgrimage to Rome, whether it's Cologne, or it's London, or it's Paris, there are places for imbibing alcohol throughout. Because we also have to think about what alcohol is at this point in time. Beer, wine, harder alcohol, spirits, whiskey, rum, so forth. It's part of an existence that is different from our experience today. You don't go to some place. It's something that is usually made in the home, shared in the home. It is a space that kind of blends different parts of life. Whether it's institutions, whether it is kingdoms, whether it is temples. And the tavern lifestyle, the drinking culture of Europe, came with all these colonists. Their perception of what it was to brew beer in the home, just like you would make bread. Both grains, the beer they'd be making at home, very low alcohol. What made it safe? You've probably heard that, it's the alcohol that makes the beer and all this type of stuff. It was safer than water. Generally, yes, much, much safer than water. But the reason is not the alcohol. It was actually because of the process of making beer. Part of that was boiling. The idea of germs and all these types of things does not come around till about 100 years ago. So we have to go back to the idea of, oh, wow, the beer is healthier because they're actually sanitizing it. So beer was something that was drank at breakfast, drank at lunch, drank throughout the day. It was something that would be, 1 to 3% alcohol most of the time. So it would be just hydration and nutritious. Would not be filtered. And so that perception of what beer was something that was brought over by all of these colonists to what becomes the British American colonies, and the Dutch American colonies, and the French American colonies, the Spanish American colonies. Everybody brought their beer with them and their wine. So early on, this is part of life. Indoors, outdoors. You had fears of inebriation, usually regulated by those religious officials, political officials. Those ideas and the ideas of regulation also brought by the colonists to the colonies. You've probably heard about this ship, right? Maybe? Mayflower. Wasn't supposed to arrive here. Wasn't supposed to be in Massachusetts. You know where it was going? Hunts Bay, further south, Virginia. Don't think about the state of Virginia. Think about the colony of Virginia, which is mid-Atlantic. Mayflower, however, had problems. Another one is a very old ship. It's actually known as a sweet ship. It had been transporting wine between England and France for a very long time. Not in the best of shape. But on the way here, they left much later than they were planning on. And, they couldn't make it where they were going. Was it because of the ship? No. Weather? It was the beer. It was the beer. They're running out of beer. Now, the sailors weren't pilgrims. The sailors were hired. The boat was hired by the pilgrims in order to get them to the British colonies. And you need that beer because, the water doesn't last very long on the ship. So the beer lasts much longer. Hey, it's been boiled. That's awesome. It's been sanitized. It also has a really cool ingredient. It's called hops. It's a green flower, grows on a vine, and acts like a preservative. It adds bitterness to the beer. It adds flavor, aroma, lots of things. But that preservation. So that beer is going to last both on the way across the ocean and on the way back. And those sailors were like, yo, you guys, we got to go back. So we need more beer. It's getting cold. Yeah, I know. Winter, it's just too bad to be you guys. That's too bad. So they pull up in the Massachusetts Bay. That's why the Mayflower comes along here. And boy, if they had planned ahead, then they really probably could have gone. By the way, funny thing, one of my ancestors was on this boat. One of the weird things is that this is an ancestor from both my father and mother's side. So let's not follow deeply into that one. But John Howland was also notable. He apparently fell off the Mayflower too, which is also a very specific piece of my family history that we don't need to dive too deeply into. But I think, if you're surviving by drinking the entire time, beer, running out of beer, I'm going to say it might have been my ancestors' fault that we've got Boston in the Massachusetts Bay. I kid. The next ship that comes along is the Arabella. Now, it's got the Puritans on it. Known for not celebrating much, looking for their city on the hill that becomes Boston, looking for a very strict religious society, Protestant society. But they knew what they're getting into. So they brought about 10,000 gallons of beer. That's enough for 4 pints per person per day, men, women, and children. Because, again, alcohol is not, the goal is not inebriation. It is the drinking culture that this is also food. This is also nutrition. That's a piece of this entire story that we have to remember. Because the tavern isn't a bar. It is not a saloon. It is much more than that. Because when they arrive here in New England, so, let's see, is this kind of little, oh yeah, screen. One of the biggest parts about this is that, hey, we're going to start brewing beer as quickly as possible. One of the first things that they do is they send ships back with malt, with hops, with all of the ingredients that you need to make beer. Wine, well, it's much more of a French thing. It was very, very expensive. Beer is something that was made in the home, something that was part of the daily life of the domestic sphere, where it's basically, well, babies, bread, and beer. That's kind of the home life, all the 3 Bs. So New England becomes a center for this European drinking culture, a center for these European styles of space, a tavern, a meeting house, a church, all of these types of things. So the Arabella arrives 1630. Coles Inn in the new city of Boston arrives 1633. 1 year after the first church. 2 years before the first school. We have priorities. Very clear priorities. Among the other firsts are also the Lamb Tavern. Now, these places would be, not everyone can read. You always have nice little signage. The Lamb Tavern. Coles Inn is the very first one, though. Quickly, we need to have licensing. Again, something that's brought over. This is part of all right, how do we control these spaces? All right, you get a liquor license, you get a brewer's license, you get specific ways to regulate these spaces outside the home. Including colleges. Harvard College, very early on, ran into a bit of trouble. Because there's this woman, Sister Bradage, in Cambridge. She was running her own small tavern, selling penny beer to the students. And apparently a lot of parents were getting kind of upset about this. The students are arriving, they're about 16, they're training to be ministers. And while they were worried that all of their sons, because patriarchal society, very clearly, that they were wasting their time in Sister Bradage's tavern. Too many pennies going towards the beer, too few pennies being spent on their time in the books. Well, after a lot of uproar about this, the president of Harvard, Dunster, was like, okay, I don't believe you. But I'm going to let them know, oh yeah, no. We'll limit them to 1 penny per stop. But he just kept telling Sister Bradage, please keep going. Because that way, our brewery that we have already made on Harvard campus won't have to fuel all of their studies. Because they weren't paying, a lot of them weren't paying in cash. They weren't paying in money. They were paying in malt. They were paying in barley, in the ingredients for beer. So the president of Harvard was like, Sister Bradish, you just keep going, limit it to 1 penny, and we'll be sure to, of course, watch very closely on this. We'll see. Not so much. Because the tavern was also a place that was not just about imbibing alcohol. Water, just to be clear. It's not opaque because of that. It's opaque because it remains cold. The tavern was one of the most important places in the entire town. Any new town would have to have a tavern. You have a meeting house, generally the church as well. You'd also need a tavern. By law, in most of these colonies, they would all set up regulations, licensing, statutes, whether in North Carolina, whether you're in Virginia, whether you're in Massachusetts, that by law, you had to make sure you had a place of entertainment in every town. Because these are not a local bar. This is a place for travelers. You need to have a place for all the people that are moving along. You need to make sure their horses are taken care of. You have to make sure they have a place to sleep. Where else are they going to sleep? It's getting cold, it's getting dark, sun is going down. Where is this random traveler going to be able to stay? You need to have a common house, a public house, an inn, an ordinary, a tavern. All these terms meaning the exact same thing. All synonymous, all the way through the 18th century. Inn was the same, ordinary, public house, tavern. It's a place to, yes, go and enjoy a conversation, but also a place to be fed, a place to stay warm, a place to make sure your horses are taken care of, a place to stay on your long roads all the way across these new colonies. Very important. And the location would also be, well, somewhat similar to this. Because you want to make sure that tavern is close by the meeting house. Now, for instance, Lexington. Nearby, you've probably stopped by the Green. They don't recognize a little bit of this. Maybe you've seen Buckman Tavern. Lexington Meeting House, the Belfry. We're looking east here. How close is Buckman Tavern to the meeting house? Very close by. A lot of times the taverns will be built adjacent to the meeting houses, to the churches. Because these meeting houses, these are the most important places in the entire town. Speaking of, Concord too. Concord actually was threatened with a fine for not having a tavern. They were threatened because they kept putting off year after year after year. And so the Massachusetts Bay Colony was like, all right, we're going to start fining you if you do not have a public house. Because it's not just a tavern, right? It is a place to join, to come and talk and hang out. These places right here, what is missing, perhaps, from this building that you see in Buckman? What I do not see, the chimneys. You do not have chimneys like you would have, say, at a Bunch of Grapes Tavern. Every tavern would have chimneys because they would have fireplaces. They would have places to stay warm. Some of these places even doubled as institutions in themselves, founding of, say, first Freemasons in New England. Bunch of Grapes would also eventually house a fete, nice big party for Washington later on. But these churches, these meeting houses, no chimneys, no heat, but houses of worship. Meeting houses. Say you're Puritan, not Purinton like me, Puritan, and you're going to a morning service, and you're going to an evening service, and it's December. How are you going to stay warm? You have to bundle up. If you're rich, you could have some hot coals there, someone served for you. But for the most part, you will just be bundled up, listening to servants, doing your religious duty, but then you will be going straight to the tavern next door. You'll be going there to stay warm. Perhaps having your sweater on the outside and imbibing a little bit for the sweater on the inside. staying warm, going right next door. And a lot of times, even ministers would make it clear that the tavern must be built right next door. One minister even said, listen, I want right next door to my house, next door to the meeting house, so that I can see the front door from my study window. Because the minister is not just a religious figure, he's also a political figure. He is going to make sure that if someone is going in and out of that tavern a little too often than he thinks is right, he will then escort that man home. And political institutions, the rulers of these new colonies would also make sure who has those licenses are only the top people in the society. The women and men of highest moral character. Which is why, for instance, you will have, in Rhode Island, of the few licenses that were available at the time, 2 of them were owned by deacons of the church, and another was by a congregational minister running the tavern, owning that license. Because look at this space. Low ceilings. You might think because they were so short. Perhaps my height. No, though I do feel very comfortable in these spaces. But it's actually because it was so cold. It was so cold. We don't have indoor heating aside from fire. And so, hey, we're going to have all that warmth. Low ceilings keeps that heat down, right? Heat rises. Keep it low. Keep it warm. Keep it a space where, yes, you can have a glass of whiskey, a glass of beer, hard cider, but you're going to stay warm regardless. That's why these places, because they would be small, they would be low ceilinged, they would be nice little huddled places where you wouldn't just be staying warm between those sermons. You wouldn't be warming up after that. You would also be having the town meeting. You would have the mayors. You would have all of the politicians. Everyone would be gathering around. Because also, aside from after churches, well, we're going to keep this a very a male-only space. And this is where all of the meetings would be held. Hey, let's vote for the next mayor. It's going to happen in the tavern. Oh, hey, we got to have a court. Let's rule, whether this criminal, perhaps for drunkenness, should be put in the stocks or something like that. Or perhaps, they were going against this aspect of religion and we'll send them away. But we're going to do all of that in the tavern, especially in the wintertime, because this is where the gathering place would be for politics, for the institutions, for the community. All of those discussions in these spaces. Now, early 18th century. In Boston, a bit different than it looks today, right? We've got the mill pond, that gets filled in. We've got Back Bay, that used to be, the Back Bay. North End, Mill Creek, South End. A number of licensed taverns, right? Retailers, black dots. Innholders, in the lighter dots. Quite a few. Early 18th century, we're still running about 15, 20, not too many, but still quite a few for the rather small population of Boston at this time. Boston is on a peninsula, is the Boston Neck. At this point in time, though, early 18th century, they're part of an empire. They're part of the British Empire. So while you have the locally brewed beer, hard cider, very, very popular. Very, very popular. You've probably heard of Johnny Appleseed, right? Leominster. Real dude, real guy. But just so you know, he wasn't actually planting trees for nutritional health. He was planting trees that you wouldn't be getting a Macintosh out of these trees. You would not be getting a nice, pink lady. These weren't nice, fruity, sweet, big apples. These were hard, knobby, sour, tart apples. Think more like crab apples. Because these apples were destined for hard cider. Which is, Jumping way ahead, during Prohibition, they cut down like thousands and thousands of apple trees because these trees are not for the healthy, nutritional meal keeping a doctor away. Hard cider was really a piece of colonial society because it was the easiest one to make. You just crush a whole bunch of apples, and there's already yeast and everything on that. Naturally ferment, run about 10%. That one's a strong one. The beer, looking at a nice table beer being most popular at about 1%. Hard cider is really big. But then comes along demon rum. British Empire. We can't separate ourselves from what else is going on, the Atlantic trade. We can't separate ourselves from the sugar that's being, produced through enslaved labor in the Caribbean. All of that, nicely refined white sugar is going to Europe. But the leftovers, molasses, that dark black strap molasses, that's going to be coming up here. Coming to Rhode Island, coming to Boston, and they're going to distill that into rum, which makes rum really, really cheap. And then much more preferred by a lot of the population of Massachusetts, especially in Boston, where just a few years later, there's a whole lot more taverns and retailers and licenses. A lot of them only, exclusively selling rum. Huge shift in the drinking culture. Drinking culture of hard cider, yes, you will have, different, drunkenness and so forth. But those taverns will suddenly become more like saloons, more like the bars that we would think of, especially in Boston, where you start seeing, lots of gangs developing. North End, South End, a lot of them drinking rum, lots of rum. Tavern now becomes a place of drunkenness. It becomes a place that these gangs start hanging out in. And, well, remember, the 5th of November, Guy Fawkes Day. Celebrating, remember, these colonists, these people all left England because they did not want to be ruled by the crown, right? They did not want to be under the eye of the monarchy. They wanted to be much farther away. And so they would celebrate something like Guy Fawkes, who attempted to blow up Parliament. Remember, the 5th of November. So here in Boston, it becomes known as Pope's Day because they were very much anti-Catholic. By which they would have the South Gang and the North Gang. They would each have their own pope. Dress up in a cart. They would all travel around town. You had the North Gang. And you had the South Gang. During Pope Day, they would both bring their popes closer and closer together. Whose pope would succeed on Pope's Day? They'd be hanging out in their own taverns down here, their own taverns up there. The dividing line being the Mill Creek between north and south. We've got the Common, right? Long Wharf, still in existence, right? They would be stopping by every tavern along the way as they moved north, as they moved south, and asking for donations for religion, for good health. Those donations could be rum, could be beer, could be money. If they did not receive their, donation for their charitable task of bringing the Pope to them, again, this is the anti-Catholic brigade here, then, well, that tavern may not see another day. The tavern might get, burned down, ransacked, destroyed. These are gangs. Violent gangs, because when they would meet up, they would battle it out. And whoever won this big street brawl, well, then they got to take their pope down and then burn it in effigy. That's part of Boston leading up to the revolution. It is a city that is already in ferment. One is being fueled by this demon rum, fueled by these gangs. That's the place we are going through the 7 Years' War, French and Indian War, That's where we are when Samuel Adams, the maltster, is failing at his family business, but becoming a very strong orator. Then we have Hancock, also a powerful politician. And you have those groups suddenly becoming more political as things in the colonies become more political. Their meeting space, their local tavern. The local tavern becomes a place, one of political intrigue, one of speaking to freedom, a place that you could speak your mind against the crown, speak your mind about the day, speak your mind about life, hold court cases, all of the above. When the Stamp Act comes through, we see a real shift. The freedom that these colonies had is now starting to be stepped upon. The freedom of the Massachusetts Assembly had been unquestioned until suddenly the king in England is like, oh, I want to make a whole lot more money back after, this whole 7-year war that we've just had. So we're going to start taxing all these guys. And you have groups start forming, such as the Sons of Liberty. Liberty trees they would find in front of taverns. Taverns become places fomenting revolution. One of them being the Green Dragon. North end of Boston. All right, Freemasons hanging out on the top. In the basement, you start seeing other groups start forming, secret groups. 3 floors, very important. When the Stamp Acts come through, a group get together. They call themselves the Loyal 9. Loyal not to the crown. Loyal to the freedom of Massachusetts. The Loyal 9 starts talking in the basement of that tavern, in the Green Dragon. Those discussions, lead to things like the burning of a ship, a British ship in Narragansett Bay. You start seeing those discussions leading to the ransacking of the governor's house. You start seeing discussions in this tavern lead to destructive, revolutionary moments, including, oh yes, just to be clear, Green Dragon again, the signal. The Tea Party. Now, the Loyal 9 quickly becomes subsumed and joins the Sons of Liberty. The Loyal 9 are, elite men. They become leaders. They join in the Sons of Liberty, while the people met in the southern Boston meeting house. Before this, they had been drinking a lot. The goal was actually to consign those ships of tea. The tea that had come from India, that had been hanging out in the London docks for far too long, about to go bad. Crown says, hey, we're going to sell it directly to those colonists. Let's bring it out to the Boston harbor. And the original plan was to hold it hostage, basically. But boy, they had been hanging out in those taverns for a long time. And they weren't drinking that 1% beer. So they head out to those boats in the harbor, and things get a little out of hand, but it leads to a spark of revolution that grows and grows. 250 years ago, last December, was the date of this revolutionary event. Fueled by conversations, by outrage, by a lot of people running from those taverns. Shortly thereafter, about 2 years. 2.5, almost exactly. Paul Revere's ride. Now, Paul Revere. Right? Silversmith, pewter, all these things. One if by land, two if by sea. Lots of portrayals of Paul Revere's ride. There's also Proctor, there's also Dawes. They don't get their own poems. They don't get as much fame, right? But in the images that portray Revere's ride, there's something that is part of each of these. that I love because it really ties in. It's showing the communities that he is riding through. What's the importance of Paul Revere's ride? The importance of, you're in Acton, you understand. But where is he riding? Well, he's going to be going by, you read inn. We have an inn in the back right there. We're going to make sure we got a nice little meeting house. We've got inn/tavern right there. Every single place that he stops along the way is going to be a tavern. A tavern where he's also drinking pints of rum. So he leaves, right? Old North Church, cuts across there. His first stop in Medford. And he was given 2 pints of rum there. Letting everyone know, British are coming. British are coming. I mean, of course, the British are much slower as they're trying to get across here. Then, okay, let's get ourselves over there. He stops at all of these different taverns. When he meets up with Hancock, when he meets up with Proctor and Dawes, they drink for a bit before, they head on back out to, let the countryside know about the British are coming. And along their way, right? I mean, of course, Revere gets captured. He's the only one. And one account of this is also saying, explains that, he was able to talk himself out of this. I mean, they take his horses, but they send him away. They don't hold him captive. He talks his way out of there, especially after a whole night of riding and stopping at, all of these, Buckman Tavern, Monroe Tavern. Hancock was keeping his, special trunk full of the dispatches in Buckman Tavern. In Lexington, tavern was a place to stay. It was the inn, it was the ordinary, it was the public house. It was also the tavern. It was also the place with the alcohol, which, looking back at Lexington, this would be the direction that the British would be coming. So when the militia hears about this, in Lexington, they all get up. They all get in line. They're all there. The British aren't there yet. So hanging out for a bit longer. Okay. We got some time. Got a little time to go. So, the captain is like, okay, go back home. Just be ready at a moment's notice. Now, a lot of those militiamen do not go home. They want to be as ready as possible. Got to stay awake through the long night. April's still pretty cold at this point in time. Do you want to go hang out in the meeting house? They're not going to be hanging out in the meeting house. They're going to go to Buckman's Tavern. They're going to spend their time in a warm space, convivial space, a place where they can stay awake and warm through a long night of drinking. And while they arrive, when the British do come through, a bit of a ragtag crew comes out of this tavern. It's a ragged line. Don't know who shot first. Did you know several militiamen are killed? Do you know if there is jeering on both sides? They are British regulars. What gives them the courage to stand up to all of those British soldiers? A liquid courage. Coming from Buckman's Tavern, British come around right here, still have the belfry. They stand there, and shots of the Revolution. Lexington Green. Another view just because it's pretty cool. So you can see meeting house, tavern, belfry. Coming around the edge, and the militia in the front right there. Of course, we know the British don't stop here. But neither do the militia. Those Minutemen continue onwards to another town that, good thing they were almost fined, because they did finally build some taverns in Concord. Otherwise, there was no place to meet, right? Otherwise, there was no place to plan for either the Patriots or for the Redcoats. Wright's Tavern, right here, right? View from the burial ground, up north, North Bridge, over that way, right? Shot heard around the world. Now, zoom in just a little bit. Now, Wright's Tavern. It was, again, not just a tavern. This is the place that earlier on in this day, the Patriots had met. They had planned for, if the British are coming, when are they going to come here? What are we going to do? Where can we hold our stands? Where can we plan all of this out? It becomes the base for both the Patriots as well as the British. It's a political space used by both sides. This tavern, right? Headquarters of the Minuteman in the early morning of April 19th. Later that day, headquarters for the British. I do appreciate a good, a good placard explaining some history. I like this early morning. Just to be clear, we were here first. Just to be clear. Still standing. Center. Always look for those chimneys. Lots of other places, very important to the revolution. Taverns had helped begin the revolution. Taverns that had been centers of power for politicians, centers of enjoyment for the poorer working classes. One such place also played an important piece of this, the Catamount Tavern, looking up towards Bennington, Vermont. There's a group there called the Green Mountain Boys, led by a very well-recorded drunkard by the name of Ethan Allen, known for continuing this is where the Green Mountain Boys were pushing against New Hampshire Grants, the New Yorkers, and then the British, setting up their own state, their own republic, actually, for a short period of time. Before they became the 14th state, they were the Vermont Republic. Catamount Tavern was where Ethan Allen held his political office, metaphorically speaking. And it is from here that they started making plans. It is here that they heard about what had happened in Lexington and Concord. That they hear about the revolution has actually begun, and boy, did they celebrate. They were thrilled with this chance to be part of a bigger story, part of a bigger future of freedom. One where they could also have their own state that had already been, he was a land prospector, so he was going to make a lot of money on this. But what was nearby Bennington, Vermont? Lake Champlain and Fort Ticonderoga. Fort Ticonderoga was not too far away, so they made plans to take it because it was only being held by a skeleton crew. Very small, maybe 50 people, soldiers. And they had to get across Lake Champlain. Luckily, it's pretty skinny at that point. And as they're trying to get over there, well, they're able to just kind of walk in. Benedict Arnold, before he, turned traitor, had same idea. He actually showed up at the Catamount Tavern himself after Ethan Allen had already left. While they were waiting, before they could cross the lake over there, they had to wait till the early morning. To keep his energy up, this is giving him a lot more credit to being standing straight. It was Ethan Allen. This guy's got the records of his levels of imbibement. Quite high levels. He was continuing to drink his rum while they were waiting. They finally get across, just a few boats, just a few men. They get across Ticonderoga. They're able to take the one guard hostage and get him out and go right up and capture Fort Ticonderoga. Very important moment. This is May 10th, 1775. Because Ticonderoga, well, the British didn't think very much of it at this point. But it had a lot of armaments, had a lot of cannon. With going from Catamount Tavern, heading over to Fort Ticonderoga, capturing this British fort very early on, because later on that fall, George Washington takes over. The Continental Army. Takes over in Cambridge Common, here in Massachusetts. And he wants to make sure that, provisions, all the rationing for all of the soldiers would also include at least 1 quart of spruce beer or cider per man per day, or 9 gallons of molasses per the company of men, 100 men per week. Molasses, think of that equaling rum. We're going to distill that stuff down. Nice little piece right here. It's from the Massachusetts Historical Society. They got this cool stuff, right? So cool. Now, George Washington takes that, all quick. Those cannon from Fort Ticonderoga get picked up by General Knox, I think Fort Knox. And because by the time he takes us over, we start the siege of Boston, which is all that cannon comes all the way through in the winter of 1775, 1776, dragged from Fort Ticonderoga across Massachusetts and gets set up in Boston to aim at Boston where the British are holding it. So cool. Now, Washington's enjoyed a lot of taverns in his day, but all the generals did. A lot of these places still stand, which is pretty cool. Because these taverns were where they would house the officers. The men would be hanging out in tents, hoping that they'd have, enough socks and shoes and hopefully, ammunition too. Places like in Tappan, New York, 76 House, right? Named afterwards, because 1776, right? So, one such location. The taverns become where they always stay. Known as inns or taverns, depends on what you want to call it. Again, they're all synonymous. Same place. New York, Francis Tavern. One of the earliest views, hosted Washington, hosted a lot of these revolutionary figures and officers. They would have their balls here. They would have their meeting spaces. This is where the revolution would continue, right? The revolution had begun through these taverns, through these drinking cultures, through these drinking spaces, through these spaces of politics, of social interaction, of religion. Ongoing. New York City, hosting others, 1776. City Tavern, Philadelphia. This is a place where, well, pretty much everyone, the Continental Congress hung out here. You're going to be in Independence Hall, and you'd also be in the tavern. This would be kind of going back and forth. All of the elites, they'd all be hanging out together, continue the conversations. Start the conversation in the tavern during the day. Well, we're going to remove all of the court documents and replace them with punch bowls. Ongoing. Benjamin Franklin, Adams when he's there, everybody. City Tavern becomes, well, the real political Philly center of the revolution. You can go to Independence Hall, you can check out the bell, but it's a city tavern where most of the actual choices and decisions were made. All the signing can go on in Independence Hall. It's more, picture perfect. And thank you very much. Cheers. Absolutely.
All righty. So we do not have a microphone, so you'll have to listen very carefully. Does anyone have a question that they would like to ask? I see a hand back here, sir.
Extrapolating from what you've said, without rum, would we still be British?
Well, we still had hard cider at 10%. And that was actually something that Samuel Adams was very big about. Because looking at how to separate yourself from the crown was also in those choices of what they would drink. Beer, locally made. He tried to really strongly advocate for that. You also had, Jefferson was actually very embarrassed at one point because he didn't have enough rum to satisfy because, well, we're tied to the whole British Empire. And so without the molasses coming in, well, he had to serve beer. Party foul. Still worked out. But you still had hard cider. You still had a very strong, well, this is actually when we go from rum to whiskey. So once you start working on the corn, working on the rye, that's why whiskey becomes the American drink more than rum. Rum still stays around all the sugar islands in the Caribbean. And whiskey, you don't have the rum rebellion after the country has begun. It's the whiskey rebellion. So that's actually one of the key pieces. Big change in the drinking choices at that point in time afterwards.
were in the Elite Nine, what men?
Oh, so yeah. So they were actually not very well known. Actually, a lot of names, the specific names actually escape me because, like, I mean, Joseph Warren would be hanging out at the Green. I mean, everyone would be hanging out at the Green Dragon. I mean, Samuel Adams would go there and talk, but the Loyal Nine were actually well known at the time, but they did not afterwards become big names. So I mean, you had like a physician, you had businessmen, but their specific names actually escape my brain right now.
They ended up joining the Sons of Liberty.
Yep. Yeah, Loyal Nine, like they formed right after the Stamp Act. It's kind of like the very first, before you even get to like the full intolerable acts and everything like that. The Stamp Act is like when they decide we're gonna start trying to push things a bit more. But the Sons of Liberty, I mean, like you have like the South End gang under like this guy Ebenezer McIntosh, who, I mean, they even like the North and South gangs as the revolution continues on, they basically join together. So their rivalry disappears in the face of the common enemy of the British, especially once the British come in and like take over Boston proper. So they join together as Sons of Liberty. The original Liberty Tree, part of the South End near Ebenezer's place, where they were like organizing at their tavern, and actually a distiller was right there too. But yeah, that's how that goes.
Young man right there.
How do alcoholic products now compare to alcoholic products back then?
Sorry, could you repeat?
How do alcoholic products now compare to alcoholic products back then?
Much safer now. I mean, that's because, well, if you just go back like 120 years, you actually have like the FDA and things like that. So if you look at beer specifically, like at this point in time in the 18th century, the beer is going to be all brown. You can't control the color. You don't have like the science. People aren't using thermometers yet. They're not using sacchrometers, which measure like the sugar content before and after the ferment happens. So you can't have a consistent article. Like now, the beer is much healthier because you also have filtration, which is really nice. Pasteurization, so the beer is going to last more than a few weeks because otherwise it would just kind of go bad, become skunked, just nasty. The rum, I mean, the processes are the same in terms of like how the fermentation happens, how the science and like the actual chemistry happens, but today it's much more carefully monitored. And monitored both by the distillers and the brewers and the government. So mostly the basics, the same. But over the course of the 19th century, the whole world shifts with the knowledge of biology, chemistry, and other sciences. So, and engineering too. Helps a lot.
Right there, so.
Oh, I was wondering if the natives ever took up the practice of making and drinking alcohol as the colonists did.
So that's a really good point because a big thing about the taverns is that they were homosocial spaces. So spaces where it was just men. Women of repute would not be allowed inside. And also they would regulate people of color. Basically all of the big kind of court cases, all of the discussions by the rulers of the colonies and then of the country, their fears are not as much, while they spoke a lot about the fears of drunkenness. This is all the way from the beginning, like from the Puritans' arrival and the Pilgrims, the worries about drunkenness, but the positives of alcohol. Very, very difficult. But their fears were not about drunkenness because how they actually acted. Their fears were about the threats to male sovereignty. The fears were about enslaved uprisings. Their fears were about basically how that space was going to be controlled or potentially lead to, lack of control over Native Americans. So a lot of that was right there. So Native Americans they were on board right away. You didn't have, a lot of the trade initially by the French, by the Dutch, by the English, would be in alcohol. Because you didn't have distillation knowledge here. You had fermentation knowledge, but it wasn't part of the culture as much. So you did not see that until the Europeans arrive. And because of all of the legislation and control over these different populations, you do not see them become brewers mostly. We have a few examples of African American, Native American, and women would always take over, only if they're white, from their husband's place. But for the most part, that close watching, both in the tavern and outside the tavern, led to like really strict limitations against the populations. Good question.
Yeah, look, the taverns were certainly about drinking was going on, but weren't they the social centers for a lot of the news and between towns and all that? Or is it multifunctional?
Oh, because the meeting house was cold. It'd be the meeting house, but more of a religious center. Yeah, the tavern would be where you'd come for all of the news. Whether you'd be like hearing, if you couldn't read, you'd be hearing like people reading out the news, like from the newspapers. This is why Paul Revere is visiting all of these taverns, because that's the place in the town. He's not going to the meeting house. He's not going to the mayor's house. He's going to the tavern. He's going to the place where he knows that the information is going to be passed as quickly as possible to the most people as possible. Because if you hear a bell, if you hear a big noise, you're going to go to the tavern. You're not going to go to the neighbor's place. You're not going to walk down the street. You're not going to go to the meeting house, because you know people are going to be in the tavern, because that's where the news is. That is where the center of the community is. That is where you're going to be celebrating something. That's where you're going to be mourning something. Everything is wrapped around this like center of the community, which is why across all of the different colonies, you had laws, statutes set down immediately that you had to have a place that was a place of entertainment, but of rest as well. A place where people could stay. A place that would have, a bed. Usually one that many people would be sleeping at the same time, because you didn't have that many beds. But a place where the horses could be fed. You have to be, if you're doing a ride like this across Massachusetts, you got to make sure you have fresh horses, fresh food, water, and you can stop at those taverns, because they have to, by law, have all of those like resources available. Great question.
Over there?
Was there a legal created back then? They wouldn't have like affected anything to do with like,
No, good question. No. You had cultural norms, but you didn't have a set drinking age. In the United States, it was 18 until the early 1980s. 21 that gets really put into hard effect in 1984 through federal control over highway funds, actually. So don't think. But at this point in time, you would not see very young men, women, or anybody in those taverns to be drinking rum. But everyone would be drinking beer at home, because it would also be 1%. It'd be super, super low, because it was safe because of the boiling process. So table beer would be the only beer that everyone would be having, which would be so low in alcohol, it's like drinking kombucha. Does that make sense? Yeah. Negligible amount. There's fermentation that occurs, but that's not the point of that drink. Yeah. Jen, go for it.
Just to extend that a little bit back to the beginning when you started talking about the family in the early years. What about little children? How was a family brought up safely if the water wasn't good to drink?
Well, the boiling. But the thing is, that's why, the perception of these drinks is not the same that we have it right now. So, it was seen as nutritious. We did not have the understanding of human physiology that we do now. We do not have germ theory at this point in time. We don't understand, the idea is also just there are humors, bad smells equal bad, well, a lot of times I kind of do, lead to sickness, there's lots of bloodletting, a different perception of what health is. And so with a diet that was quite monotonous, there's also something that the political leaders, the ones doing all the licensing, political and religious leaders at the same time, right? This was seen as nutritious. Beer nutritious, but also a lot of times the rum. So you would have that rum would be, if you added rum to a medicine. It was seen, and some spices, it would be enhancing that medicine. The burn was seen as a healthy thing instead of one that was not actually healthy for our bodies. So the perception of these drinks, whether it's rum, wine, gin, brandy, all these different things, it was seen as being healthy. Not in excess, which is to see lots of laws and regulations about drunkenness, but not about actually drinking. So that's where there's like a real difference from how we perceive it now, because we have a much better idea about the harmful effects of alcohol on our bodies. We understand human physiology and the effects of this way more than we did several hundred years ago, even 100 years ago, honestly. So it was seen as actually part of a nutritious diet in a lot of ways.
Even for 2-year-olds.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Teething, put some rum on the teeth, on like the gums. Oh yeah. Okay. Not that far ago. Yeah. Yeah, but it's also like, I mean, when you made a beer, like this is something that also came over from England, came over from Europe, where like when you're making a beer for sale, basically what you're doing is taking all the sugar from the grain. Now the first time you bring water through that, it would be much stronger because there's a lot more sugar. The more sugar equals higher alcohol, because that sugar is going to be converted by the yeast into ethyl alcohol and carbonation. So run that through again, not as much sugar, lower alcohol. Then that third run would be your table beer. Your third run would be, well, your breakfast beer. What you would be serving all day long, what you'd be serving in the fields during the workday, while you're doing harvesting, while you're planting. Because you can't be running a nice plow with a big hat, like, huge, oxen on the front, drunk. Hot summer day, you're planting, you need to make sure that you are on top of your stuff. So that's why the beer would be so low in alcohol, whether a baby could even enjoy it, healthy.
We have one last question back here.
You mentioned drunkenness, but were there other objections from the church about taverns at that time?
Not at that time, because they were not centers of drunkenness. There would be examples of drunkenness, and people would be, fined, put in the stockade, whipped, tarred and feathered. I mean, they would be punished by the community. And also that's why the minister, that one minister was like, oh, I want the tavern right next to my study. Not because I want to visit it all the time, but because I'm going to make sure those guys are going home. So it was the space was where alcohol was imbibed, but that wasn't the point. And like inebriation was not the point for vast majority of the population. The space was for political discussion. It was a space for playing games. It was a space for venting and enjoying life. It was where the community met. Before you had a general store, before you had like a club, that's where everyone would go. So alcohol was a part of that. It was part of the drinking culture. The drunkenness, that's what they would constantly watch out for.
Before we have a last round of applause, 2 things to think about. We have books and materials along here, including the way to get to the merchandise. And our next event will be December 5th. An author coming, David Mandel. And so we've been trying to get to the voices that weren't heard before, digging a little deeper. You disabused me of Johnny Appleseed. So those of you who are most interested in Time Hawk and its attempt to better understand the indigenous presence here, December 5th will be your next stop. Thank you very much.